Welcome to AZ Central. I'm Michael Squires, and here to answer your questions is a man who's been on the minds of a lot of Arizonans and a lot of Americans in recent days. Senator John McCain, of course, former presidential nominee, longtime senator.
Thanks for mentioning that. Thank you.
Recently diagnosed with brain cancer, but you said you're going to continue your work in the Senate as you receive treatment. I think one of the first questions people have is just, how are you doing?
Fine, fine. I'm doing fine. I get kind of a focused radiation for 3 weeks. I'm in the first week of it now, and then we see how it goes. Look, it's a tough business we're in, and it's a tough challenge, but I'm confident with lots of exercise, good food, and staying active that we can continue on with my work, and I'm very optimistic.
So this initial course of treatment, you say, lasts 3 weeks?
Mm-hmm. 3 weeks of this, and also pills. But I have not felt anything except feeling good. But one thing the doctors say, and I say this to all of our viewers: stay active. Stay active. That's really important. That's my last prescription.
That's the prescription from the doctor. You said you'd be back at work in the Senate in September.
Yep.
Do you anticipate that being full-time?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I would anticipate that this first round we're in would be completed in, like I say, 2 weeks, and then take some time off, and then back in the Senate. Yeah, in fact, the defense bill will be up on the floor of the Senate as soon as we get back, and I got to get that done.
I know that's a long-time focus of passion of yours. Were there any symptoms leading up to the diagnosis that caused you to get maybe a special look by your doctors?
You know, not so. Now looking back on it, I was a little more tired, but nothing really, making a huge difference. And I went for my normal physical exam, and that's when they discovered this behind my eye.
So we've said we're going to ask you some questions from our readers, things that have come through social media. And of course, the health care bill has been a topic of much conversation in recent months. And Michael Shan is wondering, you voted against the skinny repeal, what was called the skinny repeal bill. Can you talk through how you made that decision?
Well, first of all, I thought that the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, was a failure in Arizona. There's no doubt that we have only one provider per county. Premiums are going up, deductibles are going up, etc. And so the status quo was not acceptable. And then as I watched this process proceed, they basically wanted to pass what they call a skinny repeal bill and throw it in the hands of conferees, House and Senate guys, without amendments, without improvements. Our governor, who I admire enormously, had sent me 3 amendments that he wanted passed in order for him to support it. And so I could just see that it was not something that was going to fix the problem, particularly throwing it in the hands of a few conferees, of which I had no control over. So it wasn't an easy call, but I could see that it was not going to address the challenges that Arizona faces in Obamacare.
So there was a dramatic moment for those people who were watching the vote at home, where you came out and gave the thumbs down. How did that come to be? How was that?
Everybody thinks, oh, you orchestrated that beautifully. You did here's the situation. They knew that I was going to vote no, so I had to meet with McConnell. I had to meet with a whole bunch of others, and then the vice president came, and he and I have been old friends, and we talked, and we went into the vice president's office because he wanted me to talk to the president, and I talked to the president. Meanwhile, the roll call is going on, but I'm in the vice president's office talking to the president. Make a long story short, I came out, and I had made up my mind a long time before, and so I decided no. That was a very interesting moment. Probably more interesting was just before that, when I came back from Arizona and all 100 senators sat in their seats and listened to and watched my speech. I've never seen that before. It was very moving.
So in that speech, then since you bring it up, you talked about the Senate needing to return to regular order where the committees are originating the legislation, where there are public hearings on bills that are proposed, and then it comes to the floor and there's the debate there. Estelle Castillo, someone submitting a question, is wondering if, looking at this bipartisan cooperation you've called for, what are the issues you see that working on? Is it something that could happen with health care or some other issue?
First of all, the defense bill, which we'll take up as soon as we get back, that passed through the committee 27-0. Then I'm sure that tax reform is going to be a major issue as well. I'd like to see us work on this issue of restoring our infrastructure. We've got all this money parked overseas, bring it back, devote it to bridges and roads and highways, particularly in a state like ours. And of course, we have this issue of the debt limit. I mean, that's coming up. And if we don't address that, then the government shuts down. Obviously, we don't want to do this. I have to be frank with you. We've been screwing around now for 6 or 7 months, letting everything crowd in to the very end. You remember the fiscal year is over the 1st of October. So we got a lot of work to do. And we can only do a lot of it in a bipartisan basis. Does that mean we all agree? No. Does it mean that we have enough agreement that we can get overall support? Yes. And we have done it before, and we can do it again. And that's what the American people expect of us.
You bring up infrastructure. Rebecca Winninger is another person who submitted a question, kind of wondering, what do you see as critical, the critical needs? And I mean, the price tag can be kind of staggering, up to $1 trillion, I think the president has said. How do you see that getting funded?
Well, I'd like to see tax reform, of course, all of us would. But I think one of the things that we could do is we got a couple of $1 trillion parked overseas because we have the world's highest corporate tax rate, 35%. Let's make a deal with Apple and all of these people and say, okay, you bring that money back and we'll tax you at 20%, okay? But bring it back. And if you bring it back, that tax money will go to building infrastructure throughout this country. Here in Arizona, because of our growth, we are badly in need of more infrastructure. We are badly in need to fix our bridges and highways. Anybody who drives north on a Friday knows how badly we need more infrastructure. So I think that could be doable, but we'd have to have the commitment on the part of the government to take this money and put it in infrastructure, not in, you know, a lot of the other ideas that people have.
Those outside Arizona, you're referencing Interstate 17 and
yes.
Probably heading to Sedona where you enjoy hiking.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Yes.
And on Monday coming back, there was another accident that held up traffic for a long, long time. We need to have that highway expanded, but we also need I-11. And I-11 would begin at the Arizona-Sonora border, go north, go around Tucson, go around Phoenix, and go someday all the way to the Canadian border. That would have a huge effect on our economy. And I think we could do that. And everybody's for it, but we don't have the money.
So quite a few people submitting questions are wondering about a book that your colleague Jeff Flake has written, and your response to that. In it, he takes on what he describes as the nativism and populism and protectionism that he says characterizes the Trump administration and somewhat fueled his rise in the Republican primaries. What is your response to Senator Flake's book?
Senator Flake is one of the most honest men and fine men that I have ever known in the United States Senate. He is a man of integrity. He fights for what he believes in. He hates earmarks. He's a devoted family man, and it's an honor to work with him. I believe that Jeff is right in the respect that we have got to start doing things in a way that's good for the country and that we can work together on. Jeff's major complaint is that we've become so polarized that we've become paralyzed. And I believe he's one of the future leaders of the United States Senate. Jeff, I believe, is correct in a lot of his criticism because we have become so polarized. you know, again, I hate to keep bringing it up, but there's a lot of Democrats that I work with, and Republicans come to me, how can you work with that guy? I work with him because I represent the people of Arizona, all of them. Republicans, Democrats, independents, libertarian, vegetarian, whoever they are. And so I think we've got to get back, and we talked about this earlier, to a degree of debate and respect and cooperation and results. Because right now, we don't have the results.
So Senator Flake is standing out in sort of, I guess, entering this conflict with the White House openly in a book. But there have been tensions between you and the Trump White House. The president signed the Russia sanctions bill, but he's continued to criticize Congress for passing it. I'm just wondering if you think that it undermines the nation's position against Russia, which many see as a threat, or maybe one of our greatest threats, if you look outside the United States?
I think that the president had to sign it because his veto would have been overridden. The vote was 98-2 in the Senate and similar numbers in the House. So he had to sign it. And obviously he was unhappy with signing it. And so he decided to target the 98 and how many were in the House. I try very hard not to criticize what the president says, because then I just spend my time. I try to criticize what he does, and there are some things he has done that I heartily approve of. McMaster, Mattis, Kelly, I mean, there's some really good people he has surrounded himself with. And he is much better on Russia and a lot of other national security issues than his predecessor was. So a lot of us have said to the president, and by the way, he and I have a interesting relationship, but I think I've tried to tell the president, get focused on the major issues. And obviously that hasn't happened, and I regret that.
Do you think with the change in leadership, their chief of staff, that the White House will do a better job staying focused?
One can hope, because I know General Kelly for the last 30 years, and I know him to be strong and tough. And I think it would be very hard for the president to fire him. But is the president going to change? And I hope he does, but I think it's unlikely. So we're in a very interesting aspect of the Trump presidency, because he can't just keep firing everybody. I mean, that just, organizations don't work that way. But I know this about General Kelly. If it comes to a matter of principle, he'll stand for principle.
A number of readers have asked if there is a red line for you when it comes to the president, where on issues or his comportment.
I don't know, except that where relations with Russia is concerned, it just is, we have to understand Russia, and we've got to stand up to Russia. That's a very hard question, and I haven't been asked it. My answer is, I will do everything in my power to work with this president. But there may come a time where I have to stand up and just say I can't work with him. But I have done that in the past. And yet I've found ways to work with the president. He is the president of the United States. And I have found ways to work with the president, and I will continue to try to find ways to work with him. He is our president, unlike me.
Turning to another threat internationally, of course, North Korea has been rattling its saber for quite some time with these missile tests. How worried are you about the developments there, and what can be done to
First of all, this situation is not Donald Trump's fault. It was a failure of previous presidencies, and we ought to understand that. Situation is very, very complicated by the fact that there are 10,000 rockets on the DMZ that can hit Seoul, which has 26 million people in it. And there's no way we could counter all of those. That would be horrendous. The last three presidents have made deals with the North Koreans which they have not adhered to. The Chinese can and should control North Korean behavior. That's the way out, but they have not done so, and apparently they are not doing so. So this is a very risky business. I would accelerate my efforts on missile defense. I would make it clear to the North Koreans that it is the end of the rotund ruler's reign in Pyongyang, and I would make sure they knew what was at stake here. And I wouldn't threaten them with something that I'm not going to do. And that's where I part ways a bit with the president, because he's saying things that I'm not sure that we can carry out. And that's the last thing you want to do with a guy like Kim Jong-un.
Turning to domestic issues, the border wall is now being debated, funding for it in the House. How do you see that faring if they do pass $1.5 billion or so funding for that? How do you see that faring in the Senate?
I don't think that any of us are against a wall, and that can be something that is an integral part of control of the border. But we have to have an ability to surveil and watch the border, and that's with drones, that's with towers, that's with people, that's with the technology, the capability we have today, so that we can surveil the border and the walls. Listen, if you go to China, you'll see a wall. Walls are not the answer, although walls are part of the answer. And there's some practical problems. Farmers that own land right on the border, the Indian reservations. There are plenty of other challenges. Where the Rio Grande runs, you don't need a wall. You've got a river. So yes, it sounds good, and I'm for it, but I believe that it's got to be part of an overall equation rather than just saying we built a wall and we found the answer. And second of all, as we know in Economics 101, if there's a demand, there's going to be a supply. And we have to work on the demand side of it. The governor of New Hampshire declared emergency because of the deaths of opioids that is taking place in that state. So we're going to have to address the supply, but we also have to address the demand.
Well, and part of that demand is the demand for labor in the United States that many have crossed the border to work. The Trump administration is now backing legislation that would reduce legal immigration. What's your take on that?
My take on it is that 70% of the lettuce that's consumed in the United States of America in the winter is grown in Yuma, Arizona. They use workers that come from across the border. And it's just a fact that that kind of labor comes from across the border. There is work that we need people to do, that we need it on a temporary basis, and people should be, as they have for years, to be able to rotate back and forth. So I would say that we need highly skilled workers, and I'm all in favor of that aspect of the proposal, but we also have to have the low-skilled workers that provide a lot of the work that Americans just simply will not do. But finally, it has to be part of an overall package. What about the dreamers? What about all these other aspects? What about the green card holders? What about those who are in the military? I want to work to reintroduce the same package that passed through the United States Senate and was never taken up in the House.
So your diagnosis was certainly jarring for many of us, and I'm sure it's probably given you pause to reflect on your career. William Conium is wondering what you consider your most enduring accomplishments. What do you see as your legacy as a senator, as a public figure?
Year after year being elected Miss Congeniality in the United States Senate. Aside from that, I would probably say at the end of the day, work on national defense. Being chairman of the Armed Services Committee has allowed me to really have an effect for the men and women who were serving. You know, my doctors recommended that I not go back to Washington, you know, and I thought about it. There's men and women who are putting their lives on the line every hour, and I can't fly to Washington? Come on. You know, so I would argue my work on national defense is probably the most important work and legacy that I have done.
Well, we certainly wish you the best in your treatment and hope things go as well as they can.
Well, I thank you for having me on, and I thank you for the good work that the Arizona Republic does a lot of the time. Not all the time, a lot of the time. And I want to thank you for doing this interview with me. And my dear friends, I'm coming back.